Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan being delayed and the latest updates around Illinois' gun ban registry. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. As former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan's corruption proceedings continue to drag on, some are calling for ethics reforms now. Kevin Bessler files this report.
Madigan was indicted in March 2022 on 23 charges, including racketeering and bribery, but the trial has been postponed until October. The charges stem from the alleged improper dealings with the state's largest utility, ComEd. Illinois House Minority Leader Tommy McCombie says the delay is disappointing and it is unlikely any kind of ethics reforms will be addressed during the next legislative session.
They had promised that we would see something and we didn't. They didn't meet. They didn't have conversations. So as much as I would love to give my colleagues on the other side of the aisle credit, they're seeing everything that's going on. I'm not very optimistic.
Illinois lawmakers return to Springfield Tuesday, January 16th. I'm Kevin Bessler.
The final numbers for Illinois' gun ban registry leading up to the January 1st deadline are in. One high-profile politician says he's not among them. The final numbers from Illinois State Police before the January 1st deadline show a total of 29,357 individuals disclosed they possess a now-banned item. That's 1.22% of the state's 2.4 million firearm owners' ID card holders. Former State Senator Darren Bailey posted a video to social media on New Year's Day showing him shooting several banned guns and saying that he will, quote, die on his porch before he gives them up. Tuesday, he said his message is clear.
This is an issue that we have an opportunity to stand and save this republic over. And I believe that's what it's at stake and what this is all about.
Responding on X, Democratic State Senator Robert Peters said what Bailey's doing might be a detainable offense. Bailey said the gun ban is creating fear, panic, and complicity.
And they just lead to one thing after another until our freedoms are gone. And that's, again, that's what I believe is at stake with this.
Being found out of compliance could lead to a Class A misdemeanor for the first offense or a Class 3 felony for second and subsequent offenses. Those are the top stories of the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau Senior Reporter and Editor. Greg, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and yours, Dan. Here we are in 2024, and what a big year it's going to be, no question.
A lot of carryover issues, Greg, from 2023, and I'm sure we'll get some curveballs thrown in there too. First, let me tell listeners we are recording this on Thursday, January 4th, the first episode of 2024. Greg, longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan made a rare public appearance this week when he attended a hearing related to his upcoming trial on more than 24 corruption-related charges. Madigan and his attorneys were successful in delaying his scheduled trial from April of this year to October. One interesting note about the new schedule, Greg, is that the trial is now scheduled to start about a month before the November 5th elections and already into the early voting period for those elections. And on November 5th, when all of Illinois House seats are up for grabs, including seats currently held by Democratic representatives who voted for Madigan time and time again to be their speaker. That could be a little bit awkward. Before we get into that schedule, Greg, tell us about the details of why the delay.
So this all, of course, stems around the ComEd bribery scandal that broke in the summer of 2020 and had Madigan as public official A. And then months and months go by, and we get more indication that this is indeed involves Madigan, with others being charged. And even earlier this year, you had the ComEd 4, several executives from the utility company and lobbyists and the close confidant of Michael Madigan being found guilty. And while they were heading into sentencing, they had actually motioned for a delay in sentencing because of a U.S. Supreme Court case dealing with federal bribery statutes. And the judge ultimately did delay sentencing in that case. Kind of gave an indication as to what could happen with Madigan's case, who was originally scheduled to go to trial on 22 counts of racketeering in April of this year. So while a lot of people were watching for that April date to come for the trial to begin, you had Madigan's attorneys file a motion to delay the trial pending what happens out of the U.S. Supreme Court. So this week, prosecutors, they ultimately said they see no reason for the Madigan corruption trial to be delayed, saying that the bulk of the counts against Madigan do not involve the federal bribery statute and therefore would not be affected by whatever the decision is from the U.S. Supreme Court case, Snyder v. United States. And that case obviously is something that's expected to be decided later on this year. But regardless of the prosecutors essentially asking for a delay not to be granted, the judge in the case, citing the pending U.S. Supreme Court's decision, decided Wednesday to go ahead and push the start of Madigan's case. And that, as you noted, is going to be pushed back from April of this year to October of this year. So a 6-month delay in Madigan facing a list of charges and having a jury hear those charges and all of the evidence that we're expecting to get out of that, from possible wiretap phone conversations to possible undercover video recordings, things that were evident in the ComEd 4 trial. So obviously there's a lot of twists and turns in this, and something that we'll be keeping a close eye on, especially as you noted. It's going to be buttoned up right against the November 2024 election, where you've got every Illinois House seat up for grabs and about half or so of the Illinois Senate seats up for grabs. And whether or not ethics reforms are going to be a priority of the General Assembly heading into spring session, that is yet to be seen, because since the 2020 revelations of the ComEd scandal, we really haven't seen substantive ethics reforms passed at the Illinois State House that Republicans have been demanding even since before Madigan's saga began.
Let's talk a little bit more about that calendar, Greg. Early voting, if memory serves from past elections, it'll have started by the time this trial starts. So voters will already be deciding on who they want to represent them in the Illinois House. Madigan, of course, was Speaker of the House for 38 of 40 years leading up to 2020. So any lawmaker, any elected state representative who's in at least their third term right now would have, on the Democratic side anyway, would have voted for Madigan at least as Speaker at least once, many multiple times. Of course, the Republican Party is not all that competitive statewide when it comes to these House races. The Democrats do have a supermajority in the House. But what's the likelihood that Republicans will try to use, particularly those who have voted for Michael Madigan as Speaker multiple times, use any details that come out during the October trial against their opponents?
Yeah, I think even before we get to Madigan's trial and the evidence we're expecting to see, you've got evidence that was already released in the ComEd 4 trial, where there were guilty verdicts handed down to 4 individuals. And a lot of that evidence showed the kind of coordination between a close Madigan confidant and some of the other actors in the ComEd 4 story. So I would imagine that type of thing could possibly be, fair play for the political messaging that's expected heading into the November election. But the Illinois Republican Party has, even before 2020, they've regularly raised the specter of conflicts of interest, of insider dealing when discussing the power that Mike Madigan had. Because listen, he wasn't just the Speaker of the House for a historic amount of time in Illinois. He was also the chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois. So that nexus of power that he had as somebody who controlled the party purse strings while at the same time controlling what legislation was heard or ultimately passed, that nexus of power has long been a point of criticism of Republicans in Illinois. But whether or not voters will hear that message, or whether or not Democrats may counter and say Madigan's no longer in office and he's no longer part of the picture here, we'll see how that plays out with voters. But clearly, there's going to be a lot of conversation circling Madigan as we head into the final months of the 2024 election.
One last question on this topic, and that's related to ethics reform in the legislature. The legislature returns to session later this month. Really, the meat of the session gets into play in February, March, and into April. Democrats in the legislature have sort of been resistant to Republican calls for ethics reform. Among the things that Republicans had criticized were the House rules Michael Madigan created when he was the House Speaker. The new Speaker, the Speaker who replaced Madigan, Emanuel Chris Welsh, when he first took office, said he's going to take a look at those rules and change them where he thinks are necessary. But he didn't really change them all much, and that's been a constant criticism of Republicans. Now that Madigan's facing an October trial, there's this huge election. Do you think anything will get done with ethics reform in the legislature this spring session?
It's a great question, and something that has yet to be seen as we head into spring session starting later this month. And they've got days they're in, days they're out, and whether or not they actually attack substantive reforms remains to be seen. But one thing, it's not just the House rules that Republicans are looking for more parity with maybe other states, or maybe some more equity when it comes to legislation that may have bipartisan co-sponsors. Sometimes these bills don't get called because there's too much control in the hands of one person, being the leadership of each chamber, and how those bills are ultimately dispersed or dispatched. So the other things, though, that Republicans have been looking for is giving the Office of Inspector General for the General Assembly more independence in investigating claims. Because the thinking is that sometimes federal prosecutors, obviously, they have to do a thorough job in collecting evidence to be able to bring charges against somebody. But if there's speculation or allegations of impropriety or wrongdoing, Republicans say that the legislative inspector general does not have the autonomy that it needs to investigate these things and to put out these reports that could lead to even more scrutiny or calls for people to step down or to be removed. Obviously, that's a level of enforcement and investigation that Republicans are looking for in the Illinois General Assembly, but they have yet to secure that when it comes to changes in ethics. And it's gotten to the point where the previous legislative inspector general quit, calling the office a paper tiger because she didn't have the authority to issue subpoenas without getting approval from a body of lawmakers, or the ability to thoroughly investigate certain claims without having to go through that same body of lawmakers. So we'll see what happens. Of course, it's something we'll track all throughout the spring session with the CenterSquare.com.
Good point there, Greg. Why don't we move on? Big issue in 2023 that's certainly carrying over into 2024 is the migrant crisis that Chicago mostly, but also the suburbs and some other communities are facing with illegal border crossers who enter Texas being bused to the city and to the suburbs. Over the holidays, we had busload after busload after busload, and we even had private planes that flew in to the state with migrants on it. Now the state of Illinois is spending even more taxpayer dollars on services and housing for these migrants. That seems to be an issue that's not going to go away anytime soon. Give us some updates on what happened during the holiday season.
Yeah, and as you laid out there, communities outside of Chicago are having to deal with this, with buses of non-citizen migrants being dropped off and ultimately getting either into private vehicles or getting onto trains to head back to Chicago, or as you mentioned in Rockford, I believe it was, on New Year's holiday weekend, plane showed up and delivered migrants to Rockford, who were then transported by bus to Chicago. Listen, there's a lot of concerns here, the humanitarian concerns, it being cold, how they're going to feed these migrants, how they're going to shelter these migrants, what kinds of other services are going to be available. The humanitarian issue, obviously glaring, but so is the taxpayer costs. And the taxpayer cost, at least from the state taxpayers, is upwards of $460 million just in the past 12 months. Wow. This is to take on the 25,000 migrants that have arrived since August of 2022. But this week, the governor's office announced they're expanding an intake center with 6 heated tents in a Chicago area where they are intaking these migrants at a bus drop-off point. But you've also got the issue of buses that if they don't follow certain protocol, they get impounded by Chicago. So that's causing these bus drivers to possibly drop them off outside of Chicago. But you also have the states increasing funding for shelters and even extending food service contracts with an additional $2 million. So all of these dollars are coming from an additional $160 million that Governor J.B. Pritzker announced in November. But really, when you get down to it, the Democratic leadership in Illinois is asking for the Biden administration to release more resources. Even Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson recently telling CNN that he's asking for $15 billion in funds for migrants nationwide. Wow. And he says that without that, quote, significant investment from the federal government, it won't just be the city of Chicago unable to maintain the mission. The entire country is at stake, Johnson said. Well, former state senator Darren Bailey, a Republican from downstate, he's running for Congress, and he said that the border needs to be closed. He also said that the same people who wanted sanctuary cities and a sanctuary state are now fearing the future of the country. And he says that that seems hypocritical. And really the answer to this, according to Bailey and others, is that the southern U.S. border needs to be closed.
This is Illinois in focus, of course, but at the center square, we cover the country. We cover all 50 states. And the border crisis, of course, in Texas in particular, has been a huge ongoing issue. We also referenced, the elections come November in Illinois, where every single House member, about half the Senate, their seats are up. Of course, it's a presidential election year as well, Greg. President Joe Biden, is essentially the lone Democratic candidate seeking re-election. Former President Donald Trump is far and away the Republican frontrunner in the GOP primary. Former President Trump is making the border a huge issue in this campaign. So you wonder how much this border crisis that's affecting Chicago right now, how much on a national scale that's going to impact voters when it comes to the presidential election. But that's to be determined. Another issue you've been covering significantly in 2023 that's carrying over to 2024 is the gun ban that was enacted last January that included a registry that just opened officially January 1st of this year, just a few days ago. You wrote some stories over the holiday updating our readers about that.
Yeah, January 10th of 2023 was when this law was enacted by Governor J.B. Pritzker from the previous General Assembly. The measure passed during lame duck session. election. So since then, of course, we've seen stacks of lawsuits filed against the measure, and the issue even going all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and still cases pending in various jurisdictions about this. But ultimately, none of those lawsuits on a preliminary basis were able to delay that January 1st deadline. Well, the January 1st deadline having come and gone, the latest numbers that Illinois State Police released on the gun ban registry come out to about 1.22% of Illinois firearm owner ID card holders registering banned items with Illinois State Police. Now, that's not to say that all 2.4 million firearm owner ID card holders have a banned item, but that's the only metric we have to really kind of have as a guide of sorts to how many legal gun owners there are in Illinois and how many have registered. So while the governor has said that he expected people last minute to register, and there was a doubling of the total number of individuals that registered from around 15,000 to close to 30,000 people by January 1st, that's still just 1.2% of total FOID card holders who registered. So clearly, there's some saying that it shows mass non-compliance to this. And it has others asking, well, what's going to happen to those who didn't register? Are there going to be, law enforcement knocking on doors? A lot has been discussed about this, and gun owners that didn't register their banned items may be uneasy, but we'll be watching how this plays out, how it practically plays out with law enforcement and how they enforce this. Because one thing here, Dan, that's been made clear by Illinois State Police is that charges would have to be ultimately decided by local prosecutors. And in order for local prosecutors to level those charges, they have to have an investigation and a report from local law enforcement. But across the state, you've got state's attorneys and sheriffs, locally elected, who have said that they will not enforce this or they won't make it a top priority. Other areas like Cook County, maybe Lake County, these areas may have some enforcement, but we have yet to see any indication that that's the case. But while all of that's still in the ecosphere, so to speak, you've got the lawsuits that are still pending. So this week we've had some developments in the Southern District case where instead of having the Second Amendment argument that went all the way up to the Illinois Appeals Court, you've got an argument about Fifth Amendment rights. And that is actually now set for a scheduling conference next week on the 12th. And the state was ordered to respond to the Fifth Amendment arguments by January 19th. So that's in the Southern District Federal Court. Tomorrow, you've got the U.S. Supreme Court taking up in conference the possibility of the case that Dan Calkins has. His case went all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court, and it dealt with issues of conflicts of interest and requests for Illinois Supreme Court justices to recuse themselves. We've tracked that at thecentersquare.com. But the U.S. Supreme Court did take that case and put it into conference. What happens there, we shall see. Will they decide to go ahead and take that case? That's unclear, but that's clearly another thing that we're going to be watching closely, as a whole myriad of cases up and down the federal judiciary are still set to play out on the merits of this case.
Greg, we're just about out of time, but I want to reference one other thing related to this story, and that's a current politician, I guess, a former governor candidate, Republican governor candidate, former state senator Darren Bailey on New Year's Day, the day the registry opened, openly flouting his alleged violation of the law when he went on social media, showed a video of him firing a now banned weapon, said he will never comply with the law. I'm looking at the photo right now that you can see at thecentersquare.com, the Illinois page. I know he's not alone. There are plenty of people who just aren't going to comply. Greg, thank you for your insight into these very important stories. Listeners can keep up with all the stories we talked about on Illinois in Focus this week and so much more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.